Hello, I'm Dr. Kevin Golden, Dean of Theological Research and Publication. Welcome to Concordia Theology. We're blessed today to spend some time with Dr. Mark Rockenbach, Associate Professor of Practical Theology here at Concordia Seminary, and really blessing the church with a new book that is about to come out here early January from Concordia Publishing House. And Mark, the title, Unforgivable. Now, I noticed that title. I don't know if you chose that, if Ted chose it, your co-author, Ted Kober, or if it was the two of you thinking through it together, but it gets your attention rather nicely. How'd you guys come up with that title, Unforgivable?
It does, yeah. Well, it was kind of a joint thing. So there's a lot of books out there about forgiveness, but there's not a lot of resources out there for someone who's struggling to forgive or someone who is unforgivable. And so based upon research I did with my PhD work, Ted's work with Ambassador for Reconciliation, this has been kind of something we've been thinking about for quite some time, is how do you deal with someone or address an issue when it's difficult to forgive someone else. They did something major to you, you know. Mm-hmm. So like in my PhD work, I interviewed people who had been sinned against and then were able to forgive, but that did not come easy. There was a process they had to go through. There were things they learned about. And so, you know, yeah, there's a lot out there about forgiveness, but not a lot out there about when you struggle with unforgiveness, when you don't want to forgive someone. So this book is intended to be able to help people who are in that particular situation.
So I think this is a wonderful example of symbiosis with you and Ted Kober working together. Obviously, you did your PhD work in this realm. You also teach our students in this realm also, because one of the regular classes you teach, Pastoral Care in the Word, and this has got to be, I would imagine, something you bring up with the students there because they're going to be dealing with congregation members who are grappling with this same issue. Ted Kober, Ambassadors of Reconciliation, deals with this kind of stuff all the time. So exceedingly practical, all right? Now, maybe just to kind of help set that forth, unforgivable, I can imagine from when I was a parish pastor, somebody coming in to me and saying something that was greatly troubling them and how it might be unforgivable. But I also came across times when people would say, well, my husband apologized for this, and I told him, well, that's okay. Now, is that an apt response? That's okay.
Yeah, that probably wouldn't be the best response. Mm-hmm. So forgiveness ultimately comes because of what Jesus has done for us.
Right.
And one of the things the book helps to establish is that forgiveness is really something that Christians do. We can forgive because of what Christ has done for us. So when we forgive one another, we do so then in the name of Christ. We do so in the name of Jesus. And I think that's one of the struggles people have with forgiveness is they think that forgiveness has to come from them.
All right.
And so I have to do something in order to be able to forgive you. Somehow it's based upon me. And when people realize that it's not based upon you, it's based on what Christ has done, it actually makes forgiveness a lot easier. So one of the things we found, like in the research I did, when people were able to come to that understanding that forgiveness is from Christ and that they themselves are forgiven, that Christ has forgiven them, they have life and salvation in the name of Christ, and they realize how forgiven they are, it was easier for them then to forgive the other person who had sinned against them. So like saying, you know, that's okay, don't worry about it kind of thing, that's not Christian forgiveness.
Correct, yeah.
But that's what the culture says. And so I get where they get it from because, you know, we watch movies or whatever, and people will say that kind of thing. But that's not really what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is acknowledging what Christ has done for us and speaking that forgiveness to one another then so that we can move on, have a life together that is of peace and joy rather than a life together that we're angry at each other, upset at each other all the time, and then there's this unity between the two of us.
Yeah. Sin is never okay. And so that's never the way to grapple with sin. Obviously, it has to be forgiveness. Now, you started touching on the challenge that people will face in being able to forgive other individuals. Let's talk about some of the different reasons why people really struggle to forgive others. What are some of the ones that you deal with in the book as far as reasons why it's so difficult to forgive somebody else?
So one of them has to do, one of the chapters is about forgiving and forgetting. And so in the work that I've done with people, sometimes they have this idea that I only am able to forgive someone if I can forget it. So there's, the cultural term, you got to forgive and forget. But if your focus is on forgetting it, then it's not on forgiving. And the goal should not be to try to forget it. It should be to forgive it. So you can still remember. I remember lots of things that have happened to me in my past, and especially the ones that people have sinned against me, I remember the most. But if you forgive them, now you remember it as something that has been forgiven rather than something that that it's still an issue between you. So people struggle with, they think they have to forget it in order to have something forgiven.
Right.
That's one of the things that people will struggle with. The other one is consequences. Sometimes, or justice might be another way to put it. They think, well, that person must be able to experience some sort of justice or consequence, and if they do that, then you see, I can forgive them. But if they never endure any kind of consequence and they feel they don't have any justice from it, then they feel somehow, why I shouldn't forgive them. So what happens is people put themselves in the place of God. I'm the one who will decide if you get forgiveness or not, and it'll depend upon your reaction to me, how you relate to me, how sorrowful you are, those kinds of things. So that can be another thing that can get in the way of people being able to forgive, is they want some sort of justice or consequence to take place for the person who did the wrong.
Yeah, and I think I really appreciate how you just said that, as far as they put themselves in the place of God, saying, I know best how there ought to be some consequence or some kind of repercussion for what they did, rather than entrusting that to the Lord. Not only has He forgiven, but He's also the one to grapple with if there should be some kind of consequence that comes out of this, temporal or otherwise.
Right. And I think we talked about this in the book. Jonah was similar to that.
Yes.
He put himself in the place of God. He did not want to go and talk to the Ninevites because he thought that they didn't deserve forgiveness, And even after the fact, he's still complaining about it, And that's a biblical example of someone who was doing that, putting themselves in the place of God. But it's not our place to do that. Forgiveness is God's, and He gives it. And we can give that forgiveness as well to other people who have sinned against us. And that's a wonderful, good thing, but sometimes it can be a struggle to get to that point.
Right. Now, you put it very aptly there, once again, that Jonah looked on the Ninevites and said, they don't deserve forgiveness. Well, is he correct that they don't deserve forgiveness?
Well, true. They don't.
Do any of us deserve forgiveness?
And we don't either. But we know where it comes from, and we know what God has done for us through Jesus. And so, even though we don't deserve it, it's still important to speak that, though, to each other, that forgiveness, because it's a great gift to have.
It is a great gift. So, what would you say would happen when somebody is unwilling to forgive the other person? So, they refuse to forgive somebody else. What are they now enduring themselves as a result of their lack of forgiveness?
Well, when they refuse to forgive, lots of different things can happen. People can get very angry, and that anger then they can turn inward with that anger. So, like one of my research participants was very angry about what had taken place, and because she was unwilling to forgive, was struggling with forgiveness. She ended up drinking a lot. She wasn't taking care of herself physically. She was being mean to other people. I mean, she just ended up being kind of a mean person. And so because she was refusing to forgive, all that stuff kind of internalized within her, and she displayed it to people around her. And she said that. I was difficult to live with. I was a very difficult person to live with, and people didn't like being around me. So she became very bitter. So you can become bitter, you can become angry. It can have a negative impact upon you physically, spiritually, emotionally, because you're fixating on that particular thing, and then that becomes your whole life now. And you can't think or do anything else. So the other thing we talk about is rumination or cognitive looping. So what happens is people just fixate or cognitive loop on that thing, and that becomes their whole life. But what forgiveness does is it interrupts that cycle. It interrupts that looping in a very good, positive way, and helps us to think about our neighbor differently now as also someone who needs to be loved and cared for in the same way we do. So a lot of people what happens, they end up with what we call this cognitive looping taking place. They fixate upon that one thing, and they cannot think about anything else but that, and of course has all kinds of negative impacts upon them.
So is it accurate to say when they're doing that cognitive looping that they're really looking for closure on that very matter, and they're not going to get closure except by means of forgiveness? That the forgiveness brings a closure, a reconciliation to what has taken place, so that it no longer controls them and eats up their life.
Right. Well, it could be closure. Some are just looking for revenge, which might be closure for them, so it's different
But that's
stuff.
not forgiveness.
And some people just want to ignore it and think it'll just go away. If I don't think of it anymore, it'll go away. And then they run into that person at a store or somewhere else, and all of a sudden all those emotions and thoughts and that situation comes back up.
Right.
And now they're struggling with it. So they're looking for a way to get rid of it or to get back at the other person. The other person should get their consequence. There's lots of different things, but it's never ending. See, there's no ending to it, and it just keeps looping and looping and looping. Or what forgiveness does, it can bring an end to that, so that looping ends. It's not a significant negative impact upon your life and then how you respond to other people.
Now, one thing I think is going to be a great blessing from this book is it is eminently practical. Of course, forgiveness is eminently practical. Not only do we need it ourselves from the Lord, but also, as He teaches us to forgive others, we receive great practical benefit ourselves as we do that towards others. But also this book I see is eminently practical in that you weave in just very down-to-earth examples of how this happens in everyday life. So you probably don't have statistics right here, but just from your own kind of anecdotal experience with all the years that you've invested in doing work in this realm, how pervasive is this issue of individuals, Christians, struggling to forgive other individuals?
Well, my whole work has been in this area, so it may be weighted totally in that direction, but people are always struggling with forgiveness. Because anytime we're connected to other people, they're going to sin against us, they're going to do something. And so how do you negotiate that? So marriages, members of a congregation, your neighbors, family members, it's a struggle when people, so everyone's going to struggle with it in some way, shape, or form. What aspect of it they're struggling with may be different though. So one of the things we try to do with the book is it's divided into questions. So there's, I think, 18 chapters, and each chapter is a different question about the topic. So that's the thing we found, is that people had different questions about it, or were struggling with different aspects of it. So it's not that you're never going to experience it, it's just what aspect of it that you're particularly struggling with. So the idea is you could pick up the book, you could go through and say, this is the thing I need help with, and you could actually go to that chapter without having to read the whole book, and that chapter could help you with that particular thing that you're struggling with. And the other hope is, like, pastors could use this in their pastoral care. Counselors could use it with someone who's struggling with forgiveness. There's lots of different ways you could use the book that's very practical then to help people. So everyone's probably going to struggle with forgiving someone at some stage of their life, but what aspect of that is difficult for you that you need help with?
All right, and there you're getting into yet another thing I'd be interested to hear about is who you and Ted had in mind as the audience for this book. Now, you've mentioned counselors, you've mentioned pastors, general Christians, I would assume, as well. You see it as applicable kind of across the board and beneficial for all.
Right. I think anyone can benefit from it because everyone's going to struggle with forgiveness. And you could, as I say, you could use it in counseling, but our hope also is that it could be a devotional reading. So you have each chapter, but at the end of each chapter, there are discussion questions, And we also encourage you to pray. So there's actually a chapter in there about how to pray for what's going on. We teach you to do that, and then we ask you to create prayers and do that at the end of each chapter. And at the beginning of each chapter, there's actually a hymn. So we contracted with someone we sent them our manuscript, and we said, can you write hymn verses that relate to each of these chapters? And he did. And so and then in the back, I think it's in the appendix, it'll give you the tunes you could use for it, but you could just read it without, if you didn't want to sing it. But it can be very devotional, or you could also use it as, pastors could use it as a sermon series with the hymns and the topics and everything. So there's lots of different ways you could.
As you bring in a sermon series, I think running right to Lent, this would be a great Lenten series through those, especially we typically kick off Ash Wednesday with Joel chapter 2, return to the Lord your God, for he's gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. So it's really driving us towards forgiveness. Lent as a whole does that, and this could be a glorious way for a congregation to really rejoice in the gift of forgiveness.
Right. So if you're looking for a Lenten series, here it is for you.
Yeah, very good, very good. Now, let's go back to the title, Forgivable, with a question mark at the end. So why the question mark on Unforgivable?
Unforgivable, because that is the question I think people are asking. So sometimes people have sinned themselves and does something, and they feel that they're unforgivable. So often when I do presentations and stuff about reconciliation, forgiveness, it never fails. Someone will come up and say, I was able to forgive whoever for what they did, but I'm having a hard time forgiving myself for what I did. And they feel unforgivable for what they've done. So people themselves, I think, struggle with that forgiveness. Right. And then when someone has sinned against us, sometimes we see them as unforgivable. We see that what they've done is so bad that there's no way that anyone could forgive them. And why would God even forgive them? So there's also a chapter in there about abuse, for example. And one of the questions we bring up is, is an abuser unforgivable, or can they be forgiven? Because that definitely is a significant situation where you could feel that way about something that they have done. So I think it is kind of the question is, am I unforgivable? Is that other person unforgivable? And the answer is, we're all forgivable because of what Christ's done. Right. It's just the process to get there is what is important. And that process is not always very clear of how do you get from unforgivable to actually becoming a forgiving person. That is the challenge.
That is the challenge, most certainly so, because there's so much pain, so much personal heartache and sorrow and damage that has been done, so it's difficult to get there. Now, I think it's very straightforward for a theologian, for a pastor, to kind of make the point, well, of course, it's all forgivable because of Christ. If I say that something is not forgivable, what I'm really doing is diminishing Christ and saying he's not a big enough Savior to handle that one. Of course, he's a big enough Savior to handle whatever is thrown at him. The challenge is really, though, the personal reality of what we endure when we go through such things.
Yeah.
Makes it very difficult.
What's interesting, when I first started studying forgiveness and reconciliation, of course, I have a degree and background in counseling. And the psychological world, the counseling world, got into forgiveness because they had all these clients coming to them saying, I want to forgive so-and-so for what they've done. And so the counseling world started studying forgiveness. Of course, they're doing that without Christ, but they're studying forgiveness, and the idea is to give counselors something that they can use to help their clients. And so you have all these books and resources out there about forgiveness in the counseling world. They all agree it's a process, but what they don't agree on is what's included in that process. So they have different ideas about, you should do this at this point, or some say it's stages, some say it's more kind of a continuum. But the thing we bring to the table is that, yes, it is a process, because you have to deal with the emotions involved. You have to deal with the actual event, what took place. So there is a process, and everyone kind of goes through it differently. But the most significant thing is that you really can't forgive unless you first understand how forgiven you are and what God has done for you through Christ.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that we're bringing to the table that is so different even from the counseling or the psychological world, where in that world, there is no Christ. There is nothing, there is no God. You can do forgiveness without all that, so it's all based upon you. But in our book and the things we're doing, we're talking, helping to understand the importance of Christ's role in doing all of this. And that's one of the, I think one of the big factors that's different from maybe some other things out there that some people may run into.
Yeah, yeah. So you cannot have true forgiveness outside of Christ.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's why some people, I think, still struggle with forgiveness, because they connect it to themselves and their ability to do something, and it's faulty. It doesn't fully do what you want it to do, so they struggle, you know. But when you connect that to Christ, who is our God, my goodness, then everything changes. Everything is so much easier if you do it that way.
Yeah. Now, I know a key thing, and you've hit on this already, is the sense of whether somebody deserves to be forgiven. And of course, has nothing to do with deserve. It's all about Christ. He has won this for us by his death and his resurrection and such. I'm reminded of an account. I've never been able to verify this historically, but I was told that there is a French soldier in Napoleon's army who decided to go AWOL, and he was captured, he was brought back, and the appropriate punishment at that time for somebody who went AWOL was death. And so the soldier's mother comes to Napoleon, pleads for his life, and Napoleon's response was, my lady, the man does not deserve mercy. And her response was, well, if he deserved it, it wouldn't be mercy. Right? Now, I like that account. I don't know if it's historically accurate, but it does get to this point that, you know, when it comes to mercy, when it comes to forgiveness, it's not about whether we deserve it or not. It's all about what Christ has done for us.
Right.
And that's what you and Kober drive home so nicely within this book.
Right, right. Now, there definitely can be earthly consequences.
Correct.
And we do talk about that too, because some people do struggle. They're like, well, I thought I was forgiven. Why now am I still enduring this consequence? Well, consequences are there to keep you accountable so you don't do it again. Because if I could just go 80 miles in my car down the road and never get a ticket, I'd do that every day. But but if I get a ticket, there's a consequence which will prevent me from doing it, hopefully in the future. And consequences.
And therefore to protect others in the process.
That's the other thing, all consequences protect others too from my behavior, so they don't like get in an accident and hurt other people. So there are earthly consequences which are there to help protect us, and so that is another thing people kind of struggle with sometimes, especially the person maybe who've done the sin, and now there's this consequence that's part of it. But there's no eternal consequence. So you're not going to be sent to hell as a result of whatever sin that you've committed. We know that there's no, those who are forgiven in Christ, there's no eternal consequence. That is for everyone.
Right. But the temporal consequence very well may remain.
Right, that's right. And some people struggle with that, you see. They struggle with that temporal consequence, whatever that may be.
Yes. Well, this is a wonderful contribution to the life of the church. It's also a great testament to the good work of the faculty here at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. So, Mark, I commend you for the good work done on this. I'll be looking forward to what comes next, the next research and writing project that you have, but really look forward to seeing how this book that you and Ted Kober have authored together serves well the church for years ahead. And we thank you for joining us also. Join us again the next time with Concordia Theology.